Hey folks, welcome to the second video lecture of week 1 of GID 109, Intro to Web Design. How is everybody? Hopefully you enjoyed the first video lecture and you got a lot of information out of it. So at the beginning of the week we went over sort of the structure of the class, how we are going to be using Blackboard, and sort of what the expectations are for the class. So we're going to hop back into Module 1 now, and we're going to take a look at sort of the second half of the week's content. Remember, the modules are folders full of stuff that we need for the week. And so we already did the class overview and went over the class structure, the rules of engagement, etc. Hopefully by now you've taken the time to watch this video link, this brief history of the World Wide Web. We're going to continue with the history of web today, but using the handout from down below, which gets into more detail than that video did, okay? And we're going to use this as the basis for your historical speculative paper that you're going to do, which at the end of this lecture we're going to go over what that's all about as well. We're also going to look at some example websites that are sort of epitome of the time frame of how websites have been designed from kind of the late 1990s up until now. And we may or may not get to some of the Apple versus Microsoft stuff. If we don't get to that in this lecture, we will tackle it next time around. This will be sort of appearing throughout the semester anyway. Now these links at the bottom here, these are linked PDFs, and just so you know, when you click on them, it's going to open up a new tab and sort of show you the PDF in your browser. If you can't see the entire PDF in your browser, depending on what your browser limitations are, or if you simply want to download them so you have an actual digital file for yourself, simply go up here to the upper right corner and hit the download button, and it will drop it onto your computer so you can look at the handout directly and you can have it with you, okay? All right, so let's go and take a look at that handout and get rolling with the history of the web. Okay, so this is the handout here. Okay, so what we ubiquitously refer to as the Internet is more specifically called the World Wide Web. However, it did not come into being in its current state. In fact, it was almost a complete accident that it was actually developed. Back in 1969, there was a development of something called the ARPANET. Now, the ARPANET, ARPA stands for the Advanced Research Project Agency Network, which is the entire name of ARPANET. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. This was an early computer network, and it was the first computer network to implement the TCP/IP protocol suite. Now, you're probably thinking, what the heck is TCP/IP? Well, it is the foundational structure for what eventually became the Internet. Now, the ARPANET was initially founded by the Advanced Design Research Project Agency, ARPA, in conjunction with the United States Department of Defense, the military, the U.S. military. So the reason why they wanted to create this network is because at the time, in 1969, there was a lot of important and crucial information that the military needed to share with its research partners. Many of the research partners were scientists, research organizations, universities who worked in conjunction with the military on a variety of military and Department of Defense projects. And so a lot of this information was top secret and had to be shared in a safe way. And so you'll see here in the map in the background in 1969 that UCLA, the University of UCLA, and 3 military installations in Utah and in California, Southern California, all needed to share information. And so they came up with sort of this basic computer network. Now, of course, computer networks existed before this, but they were what you would call tangible networks. All a network is if you take 2 computers in the same room to each other and you connect them by some sort of cable or some sort of wire, and they can then talk to each other and share information, that's a network. And so the idea of networks was not new in 1969. Computers had been interconnected to each other within physical spaces for a long time. What was new is that they were trying to share information over different distances and different locations without a physical connection. So obviously Utah is pretty far away from Southern California. And so they needed to share information between each other, and they couldn't just run a really long cable between states. And so they decided to, using that TCP/IP protocol, to tap into existing means of communication. Now, of course, wired means of communication at the time existed of telephone lines. So there were telephone poles all over the country, all over the world. And these, of course, connect houses and buildings and cities using these telephone lines so people could communicate using their telephone. So what they did is they leveraged that pre-existing network, and they put in special cables and special secure lines that could only be used by the military and by the folks over at ARPA to communicate and send information back and forth. What it did is it took digital files, it broken down into smaller little packets, little bite-sized pieces, little digital pieces, and would send them over these phone lines in ways that were small and undetectable and secure. Well, anyway, this was one of the first times that information had been sent over fairly long distances. Now, we look at it now and we consider that the World Wide Web and the internet is literally over the entire world, and just sending information from Utah to Southern California doesn't seem like much of an accomplishment, but in 1969, it was a huge accomplishment. Now, of course, the general public knew nothing about this. This was very much for government military purposes, right? Well, between 1969 and 1982, the ARPANET grew exponentially across the entire country. And you can see the lower map here, which shows all the various locations that the ARPANET connected by the time they got to 1982. So in the course of those many years, they expanded it literally from Hawaii all the way over to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to Harvard University, and then down to Florida and Texas and all through the center of the country. So again, even compared to the World Wide Web today, this is not a lot of area, but this was a huge accomplishment by 1982. Well, the interesting thing that the military and the government did at this point is that they overbuilt the network, meaning that they created more connections than they really needed. So ultimately, as time went on, it turned out that a lot of this network that they had created in the country for their top secret military communications was going unused. So these cables, these connections were just sort of sitting dormant. And so at a certain point, they decided to sort of farm out that space, as it were. So now this moves us, again, we're still in 1982, and this is October, so late 1982. This here is a schematic showing all the connectivity points within the ARPANET at the time. Okay, so this is almost sort of like an electronics communication schematic showing the different connectivity points across the whole United States, right? And so this really sort of shows the level of expanse that there was with regard to the ARPANET at the time. So in 1982, like I said, they had too much connectivity that they did not need. And so some of their military partners, like I said, were universities and research facilities. Well, these universities and research facilities, they had a good use for this network. They needed to share information with each other, whether it be educational materials or other types of research projects they were working on. And so they basically asked the military and the ARPA people, hey, could we start using some of this network since we're not using all of it? And they allowed it. So this became known as the Internet. Now, it really just sort of became a renaming of a section of the ARPANET, right? The military still used part of that network for their sort of top secret communications, and it remained known as the ARPANET. But then they sort of gave away or allowed access to the remainder of it that was not being used to their sort of educational and research partners, and it got renamed the Internet in 1982. So the Internet, of course, is a global system of interconnected computer networks that uses the Internet Protocol, which we just discussed, TCP/IP, that links devices worldwide. So starting in 1982, these educational and research facilities started expanding the network outside of the United States. Now, the military had already expanded it to Hawaii, which of course is still part of the United States, but it is not continental. And so it was easy enough, they figured, to go to other countries since they had already gone out to Hawaii. So it is essentially a larger network made up of smaller networks, and it grew beyond the military usage to include other government agencies, right? Because the government isn't just the military, there's lots of other government agencies that had good use for it, as well as academic networks like colleges and universities and research facilities. So it was created on top of that foundation of the ARPANET that I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, and of course it is meant for use beyond military applications. So these days, today, the Internet also includes all sorts of private networks, public networks, interdependent business networks, and carries a vast range of information, resources, and services everything from email to telephone lines that work over the internet to file sharing to the World Wide Web. And now you're probably thinking, wait a minute, isn't the World Wide Web and the internet the same thing? No, not really. We actually use those two terms, World Wide Web and internet, interchangeably today, but in fact they're not the same thing. The internet is the network that the World Wide Web lives on top of, right? So if you think about it this way, if you think about the way a house is made, right? When you're building a house, you have to fill all the walls in the house with wires, right? See this graphic over here? This is all the interconnectivity of the internet. So imagine that this is all sort of wires in your house, right? And that runs electricity from the electrical source outside of your house all through your house. But if all you had in your house was a bunch of wires just going to these open sockets, you wouldn't be able to do much with it, right? You have to have light switches, and you have to have plugs, and you have to have all sorts of other electrical devices attached to the wires for them to really be super useful, right? And so the internet, at least beginning in 1982, as they started to expand it through the globe, was really like a house full of wires. But there were no switches, no plugs, no lights, nothing really easy to use it with. Then in 1989, a short time later, this guy comes along, Tim Berners-Lee. So the World Wide Web, commonly known as the web, is an information system that is built on top of the internet. It's built over the internet, where documents and other web resources are identified using a new protocol called the Uniform Resource Locator, or URLs, more commonly referred to as domains. So when you type in a web address into a web browser, right, www.pbs.com or www.bigbluewalrus.com or whatever, that is a domain name, but really it's a URL. It's a Uniform Resource Locator address. And that system of identifying locations as pages was invented by Tim Berners-Lee. Now, the reason he came up with this is because he was working at a place called CERN in Geneva, Switzerland. It was a computer research programming location in Switzerland, right? And the problem he had is that, sure, the military had released part of their ARPANET for academic and non-military use. And now it was great that this sort of academic and research community, including the place he worked at, CERN, had access to this larger internet, but there was no way to actually easily get information from one person to the other. It was like somebody giving you a house full of wires, but no light switches, no plugs, no lights. So you needed ways to harness that electricity, or in this case, harness that connectivity. And so nobody had really figured it out. Different companies and organizations sort of had their own interconnected systems where they could talk to each other, but there was no system where everybody who could get onto the internet could talk to everybody else. And so the sort of birth of the internet didn't really happen. It just sort of sat there until somebody figured out an easy way to do this. And that was Tim Berners-Lee. So again, he came up with the idea of URLs. The resources for the WWW, the World Wide Web, are presented as what we now call web pages, of course, which we take for granted now, but they didn't exist at the time, which is a weird thing to think about, that they're so common now. But at the time, people were transferring files just as files. There were no visual pages to land on to share information. And there was not a uniform computer language that everybody could use to write these web pages, right? So Tim Berners-Lee came up with the concept of web pages, and he came up with the coding language HTTP, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And so these are accessed using web browsers, which are pieces of software we use to access the web. Now, you guys are familiar with web browsers, of course. We've got Safari, we've got Google Chrome, you've got all sorts of web browsers. But again, they didn't exist at this point. So Tim Berners-Lee wrote the programming for the first web browser as well, the first piece of software designed to access the internet using Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which would then allow you to create web pages and assign addresses to them as URLs. So Tim Berners-Lee is from England, and you might think, wow, this is such a great, amazing thing he did. He must have had a huge vision for this. But the truth of the matter is he just needed to communicate with his colleagues across the Atlantic Ocean. See, he was not only a researcher at CERN, but he was also a professor at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he was a professor in England. And he spent about half of his year in the United States teaching, and the other half of his year he was back in England teaching, and then of course he would work at CERN in Switzerland at the same time. He was a busy guy. Well, he had projects going on. He was working on these projects, and he had colleagues and coworkers in all three places that he needed to communicate with. And similar to today, he had files and documents he was working on that were simply too big to share by email. Not to mention the fact you have to remember, at this point in 1989, while email existed, it was a much simpler version of email than we have now, and you couldn't really send very large files in it. And so he did not have a simple way to share these large files that were necessary for the projects he was working on with his colleagues across the ocean. And so he knew the internet was there, of course. His universities that he worked at and his research center that he worked at in Switzerland all had access to it. But again, there was no simple way to transfer things. And so he thought, I'm going to figure this out. And that's what he did. He was really trying to solve a problem of his own so that he and his colleagues could simply share information more quickly and more efficiently. And so he worked on it from 1989 through essentially 1991. He wrote the first web browser code in 1990 while still working for CERN. And then the browser was released outside of CERN in 1991. So now here's the interesting thing, is that after he invented all these technologies that essentially became the World Wide Web, he and his bosses at CERN decided to do something unprecedented. They decided not to try to make money off of it. You would think that somebody coming up with a solution for worldwide communication would want to turn it into a money-making company, right? And charge people fees to access it. But no, Tim Berners-Lee and his bosses over at CERN, they pretty much immediately decided that once they perfected this system, that they were just going to give it away. They were just going to release it to the public and let everybody use it. And so he designed the first web page, and the first web page was about how to make web pages, which makes perfect sense, right? And he released all the information about how the coding system worked and how to actually build web pages and how to connect things to the internet and therefore easily share your own information. And so it was released to the public in August of 1991. So he started in 89 and it was released to the public in August of 91, and the rest is history. So that really became the kernel for the World Wide Web, and then with that free information released to the world, everybody started sort of building web pages. So 1992 is when he created that first web page. So now that the information was out there, of course, he wanted to teach people how to make web pages. So this is what the first web page looks like. This is the very first web page ever. So it's literally a website explaining the concept of a website, which is hilarious. So here it is. You can see it. This is a screenshot of it. It explains what hypermedia is. It explains things like mailing lists. It explains all sorts of different software that's used and how websites are built. It talks about FTP, which is File Transfer Protocol, and basically all the various things in existence. In your handout, there is a link which actually takes you to the very first web page. It's still in existence, so you can go visit it if you would like. All right, so Tim Berners-Lee put that up in 1992. Like I said, all the information was released to the public in 91. And then this brings us to what we call sort of the phases of the World Wide Web. Now that it was released to the public and people started building their own web pages, and when I say people, it was everybody from hobbyists to amateur computer programmers to large companies. Everybody was sort of getting in on it. But it was still early in its technological evolution. There were not the same kind of features available on the web that we see now. For example, no streaming video, right? No beautiful photography. It was pretty limited. Now, a lot of those limitations didn't necessarily come from the World Wide Web itself, but came from the computers that existed at the time. Computers that we have today, large screens, high resolution, very fast processors, the ability to, stream video, listen to music, and do work all at the same time. Computers weren't that powerful at the time in 1992. They couldn't do all that stuff. The number of fonts that existed for computers were not like we have now. They didn't look the same. They didn't function the same. The screen resolution, the video cards were not as advanced as they are now. And so a lot of the limitations of the World Wide Web and those early web pages were really dictated by the receiving computers, not necessarily the World Wide Web itself. So the very first stage of the World Wide Web, of course, retroactively is referred to as Web 1.0. And this sort of officially launched in 1992 with that first web page that Tim Berners-Lee put up, right? So you'll notice that early pages in the Web 1.0 are pretty simple. Here's an example of one of them right here, okay? So Web 1.0 refers to the first stage of the World Wide Web's evolution. Content creators were few at the time. Not a lot of people were making web pages. Not a lot of people even knew the web existed. Because sure, they released it to the public, but it's not like they went on a huge marketing campaign to promote it to the world. It was just out there. And so, of course, educators, researchers, people who worked at universities, government agencies who were not the military, they knew about it first because they were already tapped into the internet. And then slowly the word got out there and people in the public started using it. But initially, in 1992, there were very few people making web pages, and there were very few people consuming web pages. The term web designer hadn't even been coined yet, because nobody really designed a web page. They just put up information that was a bunch of text and maybe some basic graphics. They didn't think of themselves as designers, mostly because their ability to design space on the web was limited by the technology, right? So the web at this stage consisted mainly of static information-based pages that were very much a read-only situation. You went to the web page, you read the information. There were hyperlinks, right? These blue underlined bits of text here would obviously act as links and take you to other web pages. But it was sort of a one-way street. You read the information, you consumed the information. You didn't communicate with anybody over the web. They were just giving you information, right? So like I said, it's a one-way street in terms of information. These early pages were hosted on ISP-run web servers or on free hosting services such as GeoCities. This here is a screenshot of the first GeoCities website. And you can see that, it's not designed particularly nicely by today's standards. But at the time, this is what they could do. It was a lot of text, a couple of basic graphics, but really nothing amazing. So that's the Web 1.0 movement. Then a few years later, so we were in 1992, so now in 1999, 7 years later, comes about the Web 2.0 movement, right? So Web 2.0, which is also known as the participatory or social web, refers to the stage of the World Wide Web's development that began to emphasize user-generated content, right? In Web 1.0, only the people who knew how to build web pages could create any sort of content. And like I said, it was a one-way street. You just absorbed the information. You didn't create any information, and you didn't participate in any way. But Web 2.0 brought user-generated content, more ease of use for the web pages, participatory culture, and interoperability, meaning that the web pages and access to the web could be compatible with other products, other systems, and other devices. The World Wide Web really began to expand in 1999, and the way in which you could access the web really became more available. Other web browsers became available. Other software companies started developing their own web browsers, so it was easier for people to get online. And there were also what we call walled garden systems that began to pop up, which were sort of more curated experiences for getting onto the web. So the transition from the Web 1.0 stage and the Web 2.0 stage was actually really gradual. And there's really no precise date where you can say, oh, now we're in the Web 2.0 era. But the term Web 2.0 was coined in 1999, which is very appropriate because it was the end of the 1990s, right before we got into 2000. It was a big change. So it seems appropriate that that's when it changed. But the first recognizable social media site, because remember, Web 2.0 is known as the participatory or social part of the web. It dates back that far where people started to communicate with other people on the web. So the first site that we now recognize as what we call social media was called 6 Degrees. And it was in operation from 1997 to 2001. And it enabled their users to upload a profile photo, make friends with other users. Sounds kind of familiar, right? That's sort of the basis of most social media today, is to connect with people. So, and then later in 1999, right around the time Web 2.0 was coined as a phrase, the first blogging sites became popular, which were now platforms where everyday people could start putting their own content on the web, whereas before it was a limited number of organizations and companies who did that. So that's the Web 2.0 movement. Then In 2006, now this goes for a whole 7 years, right? From 1999 to 2006, we remained in the Web 2.0 movement. Now, in 2006, we move into what is now known as the Web 3.0 movement. Now, the nicknames for this are the intelligent web or the semantic web, and that phrase was coined in 2006 by John Markoff of the New York Times, which is why we date the transition from 2 to 3 as 2006. Now, the evolution of the web in this stage are marked by technologies such as natural language search, right? There were search engines at the time, but you would have to know the exact phrasing. You would have to type the phrasing just the right way. There were all sorts of protocols about how to type your searches, or you weren't going to find the things you were looking for. Well, new web technology, new programming allowed us to start using natural language search. You would just go to your search engine and start typing things in the way you would talk, and it would search for things based on that. So a certain amount of artificial intelligence was being developed to help search through dense databases for information just based on more simple language. Data mining became a thing where companies started paying attention to what people were doing on the web and able to sort of really sort of examine and look at and analyze the data that was being put together. Machine learning, recommendation agents, and of course, like I said, artificial intelligence technologies began coming into being in 2006. Now, of course, a lot of times from a science fiction point of view, we think about artificial intelligence and we think about, robots or AI, Jarvis from Iron Man's suit. And while that is true, most artificial intelligence is a little less exciting than what we see in the movies. It is essentially a piece of programming that can learn from what people do with it and around it and what data is put into it. And then it learns things and can therefore make intelligent decisions because of that. Now, all of that is programming, but it's still artificial intelligence. So these artificial intelligence technologies emphasized machine-facilitated understanding of information. And if it wasn't for this movement, we wouldn't have what we have today in terms of digital assistants, search engines that are naturally built, and so on. So while these technologies provide a more productive and intuitive user experience, they have also been the subject of debate because it requires the owners of these web pages and the companies that own them to really access our personal information and our data and maybe put into question your privacy as you use things on the web. Now, this, of course, is a much larger debate, which we won't get into here, but essentially it's the balance between convenience and privacy. If you want to be able to find things easily on the web, if you want to have advertisement that shows up that is appropriate for you and stuff that you're not interested in, if you want to have passwords saved for you on websites so you can easily access them, if you want to have your profiles saved, all these things that we find so convenient about the web, that requires sharing information with these companies and these artificial intelligences, and of course that comes up for debate. So as such, new web browsers such as Brave, which you can see down here, have started to appear since 2006, which essentially tries to block your activity on the web and gives you a more anonymous experience on the web because some people are concerned about privacy now. Okay, so that's the Web 3.0 movement, which frankly, in 2020, we are roughly still kind of in to a certain degree. As you've probably noticed as we've gone through this here, the demarcation between the different levels of web evolution are not exactly a hard line in the sand. They evolve slowly. Okay, now the Web 4.0 movement started in 2018, so I just got through saying we're still in the Web 3.0 movement. It's kind of just coming to an end now, while at the same time the Web 4.0 movement sort of just got rolling a couple of years ago in 2018. So it's sort of a slow passing of the baton, meaning that some websites you visit, some apps that you use on your mobile devices are still very much using Web 3.0 technology, and others are now starting to use newer or more evolved technology, which would be considered under the Web 4.0 movement. And so there's always that crossover period, right? So here we are in the Web 4.0 movement, which, like I said, we are just at the birth of right now. We're only 2 years into it, a year and a half into it. And this is referred to as the ubiquitous web or the symbiotic web, where being on the web is less of a purposeful action, such as opening a web browser or a web app, and more of an environment that we enter into via a variety of devices and technologies. What do I mean by that? So up until this point, getting on the web involved sitting down at your computer, computer or opening up your tablet or opening up your smartphone and opening up a web browser and then navigating somewhere. You would either start with Google, or you would type in a web address, or on your phone or your tablet you would tap an app, and you would very purposely make a choice to get onto the web to do something. Do some shopping, play a game, get on social media, whatever. All of those things were done purposely. Well, what is part of Web 4.0 is that a lot of our experiences, both on computers and mobile devices, and even in other places like riding the train, driving in your car, using an ATM machine, in all of those situations, you are also on the web, but you did not make a purposeful choice to be on the web. You just are. So user-owned devices such as smartphones, tablets, car-based technology, and wearable technology such as smartwatches and other things, and technologies owned by commercial and municipal organizations regularly share information with each other over the web, meaning that Web 4.0 users are always connected to the web, and the line between human and device has begun to blur. Now that sounds very ominous and very futuristic and scientific, right? But really what we're talking about is that the web has now been leveraged to communicate information about things we are doing, whether you are purposely connecting or not. I'll give you an example. If you drive a car and you drive on highways that used to have toll booths, remember we used to have toll booths where you would have to stop and hand money to somebody? Nowadays we all have transponders in our car through the E-ZPass system. You get a transponder, you sign up for an account on E-ZPass, they mail you your transponder, you stick it in your car, and you drive along the highway. Well, where a toll booth used to be is now a transponder check-in point, right? And you drive under it, and the transponder communicates wirelessly to the transponder checkout point, and money from your attached bank account transfers from you to the state or the city, so you pay your toll. Sounds super convenient, right? Well, how does that information get transferred? Over the World Wide Web. Those transponders are communicating using wireless technology to the transponder stations. The transponder stations are transferring information over the World Wide Web through a secure network to the owners of those transponder stations. So you are connecting to the web every time you drive under a transponder station, right? Now you might be thinking, well, that's no big deal. I'm just paying my toll. Who cares? But do they use that data, that information, for anything else? Yes, they do. For example, if you are driving down the highway and you go under one transponder station and then 10 miles later you drive under another one, they can use the time that it took you to get from one transponder station to the second one over the distance of 10 miles to calculate your speed and how fast you were going. And sometimes you might find yourself getting a speeding ticket in the mail and you don't remember getting pulled over by anybody. It's because you didn't get pulled over by the police. They simply tracked your speed from one transponder station to another, and if they found you were speeding, you are sent a ticket in the mail. So they're using the World Wide Web to track what you are doing using a web-connected device, your E-ZPass, without you purposely connecting to it. Now, all of these are in the terms of use for all of these devices that we use. ATM machines work the same way. Passes to get onto the trains and the buses work exactly the same way, and of course your smartphone or your wearable device that you carry around with you are always connected to the internet in some way, shape, or form. And so this ubiquitous or symbiotic web still has the actions of us purposely getting on the web. Let me open up an app, let me open up a web page, but it also has a variety of connectivity where it just happens automatically. And you are opting into it by simply using or carrying the device in question. So that's where we are right now in the Web 4.0 movement. And this, of course, will continue for a long time. We're only in the infant stages of it. We're only a couple of years after this stage really began to come into being. And so you would think at this point, well, we must be done with going over the history of the web because we're caught up with real life, right? Well, remember, this paper that you're going to do is a research or speculative paper, meaning that we also can look at the technology that is currently being used and sort of predict what is coming. And when I say we, not just us, but the experts in the field, including Tim Berners-Lee, the guy that invented the web in the first place. He is still around, and he is still giving talks and lectures and studying the World Wide Web. And since he gave it away to the world, he doesn't have ownership over it. He just gets to talk about it and sort of give his opinion. So the next movement is obviously going to be Web 5.0, and it doesn't have a name yet, right? Now, they've sort of roughly been talking about it as the emotional web, and this is what's being predicted at the moment. Now, we don't know when this is going to happen, but the technology is being worked on and very much exists already. So Web 5.0 will be about the emotional interaction between humans and computers, right? So now we're sort of permanently connected to the web through our devices. We've already talked about that. That's the Web 4.0 movement. But the next big movement through advanced artificial intelligence will be for humans to make emotional connections with their computers and their devices, which sounds a little creepy. But think about it, that sort of thing already exists to some degree, right? There's AI technology, there's a variety of bots and whatnot we can connect with. The interaction will become a daily habit for a lot of people based on neurotechnology. So currently the web is emotionally neutral. The majority of the places we go on the web do not have an opinion about us or what we're doing. You can talk to Siri or talk to your digital assistant, talk to Alexa or whatever, and you can ask it to do things for you. And of course, it will give you information and it will do things for you. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Siri or Alexa cares about you or has any information that will be useful to you simply by interacting with you. Prediction with the Web 5.0 movement is that these digital assistants that we have now that simply feed us information based on questions we ask, they respond to us, will now be able to predict things we need in advance without us doing anything. What will drive these predictions? Well, previous behavior, right? If you open up your phone every morning and you say, hey Siri, what's the weather today? And you do it every day roughly at the same time, eventually it'll be able to predict that that's what you're going to do. And so at a certain time every day, Siri will just turn itself on and say, hey, the weather today is going to be this, because it just is expecting you to want this based on previous behavior. So a lot of it will be based on previous behavior. Also, most of our devices, of course, have cameras attached to them. We use them for things like FaceTime and video chatting and all sorts of other things. The other prediction with Web 5.0 is that these digital assistants that run on artificial intelligence will be able to access your camera. And of course, you'll have to give permission for it to do this in advance, but it'll be able to access your camera, take a look at you, and offer things based on how you look. So it might say to me, hey, good morning, Chris. How you doing today? You look like you want to go outside today. How about we go for a walk? Or, hey, you look a little bit hungry. How about we go get some food? Or you're looking a little sick today. Should I call your doctor for you? It'll be more interactive and therefore emotionally connected to you. Now, of course, computers can't actually care about you. Maybe, I don't know. But the idea is that it will use all sorts of data that it will collect based on your previous experiences, things you have done repetitively, as well as what it can see and hear from you using both the microphone and the camera on the phone. Not to mention the fact there are a bunch of haptic sensors built into smart devices that can tell how you're holding it, whether or not your hands are shaking, what your pulse is, all these other things that you can tell through watches and phones and whatnot, and it will make emotional decisions about your needs based on this information. Now, so far, this is just speculation, but a lot of this technology exists already. If you think about the way that smartwatches work, it actually already taps into a lot of this emotional web, and it is definitely heading in this direction. Now, if you want to hear more about it from Tim Berners-Lee himself, he sort of plants the seeds for this new, open, more widely adopted and linked web in a talk that he gave back in 2009. So even that far back, they were already thinking about this evolution of the web. So you can click this link here and go check out his talk. Okay, so that is that. That is our quick overview of the World Wide Web, back to the internet, all the way back to the ARPANET, dating back from 1969 to today. Now, clearly, there is much more you can learn about this out there in the world, right? Now, as far as the evolution of web design goes, because of course this is a web design class, we're going to be designing a couple of websites in this class. Let's take a look at how some of these designs have evolved over time. Specifically, we're going to take a look at websites that I've actually designed, because I've been designing since 2000. I've been designing websites. I've been a visual designer and a content creator since 1994. And I was working primarily in print and event graphics before that, but I designed my first website in 2000 and have been a web designer since then. So we're going to take a look here at sort of an evolution of that. This here is the very first website that I designed. This is actually an intranet site, meaning that it did not go out to the world. It was just used within a company, within their own personal network. And it's entirely visually based. The technology that we used at the time was referred to slice and dice. Now, that's not a technical term, that's kind of a slang term. But basically what we would do is we would design things visually using Photoshop, and we would put it together in what's called slices or pieces, kind of like a puzzle. And then we would move it into an editor like Dreamweaver. And write code behind it so that different pieces of this image would become interactive. And it was a stagnant image, it was a big flat image, but you could make certain areas interactive using what's called sliced or chosen hotspots. So that's the first one, and this was literally in the year 1999 I designed this. Now I said 2000 I really started doing this, but I did some of these smaller ones before that, about a year beforehand. So this is the second one that I did. This was for a donut company. And again, you can see this is very visual in nature. It's basically a big graphic that was put together using slice and dice. Same sort of idea. And then 2000 is the first corporate website that I did. This was for a larger corporation, actually out in California. And you can see the evolution from being essentially just a big graphic to being something that resembles more of a modern web page. This uses columns and rows and modules and segments, more similar to the way websites are designed today. There's still a lot of visual elements and graphics that are flat and non-interactive, like all these logos over here for this printer supply company. But a lot of it is interactive text as well, like the information in the middle here is all actual text that can be interactive and therefore be read by search engines like Google. The links on the left are actual text as well, but these are all graphics. Whereas in these previous ones, this text is not real text. It's just an image that's broken up into pieces. So this one was in the year 2000, and then a little bit later, designed this one. Now this site actually never got finalized. This was a prototype, so you'll notice the text in the middle is not real. It's just dummy text, lorem ipsum. Mostly down here. And so this has some visual elements like these logos and then some real text, and it's broken up into segments. This has a database-driven search feature, right, which you notice the previous sites did not have. This was around the time when database-driven search was becoming a possibility for websites, and so we incorporated it into this particular website. And you can see that obviously the interactivity is a little more modern looking, right? A little more white space involved, feels more like kind of a current website. Then this one here was in 2002, I believe, and you can't see it here in this screenshot, but this text at the bottom was all animated. It would slide around on the screen, sort of showing a bit of animation as the words got bigger and smaller and moved around a little bit. This here again was a slightly more modern advancement, still using some stagnant images over here, but a lot of interactivity in text. And this also got to resize itself. It was somewhat responsive. Not like responsive websites are today, but if you resize the browser, these words in the upper navigation would move closer together or move further apart, so it could space out a little bit more. Here's another one from about the mid-2000s. And this has a interactive gallery in it, which is the first time I did something like this. So again, this is a series of photographs. Each of these dots represents the different photographs, and you can scroll through it. Now, these are so commonplace today. We see these everywhere that you're probably thinking, well, that's not that exciting. But back in the early to mid-2000s, this was a new thing. And you can see that all of this is still very visual. Now, a lot of the sites I do are generally visual, even though they become more interactive, because I like a lot of rich sort of visual design. This one here I built around 2006 for this company that I worked for. And this is a heavily visual site because they wanted it to have a very historic kind of feel that was very specific to the business that it was. You can see that it's a farm, but embedded in that is a lot of interactive text and various ways of linking through the navigation, including this navigation system and then this navigation system, as well as the tabs of what is supposed to be a menu box up top here. Even things like the address were interactive in that it would take you to a mapping system so you could find where the place was and whatnot. This one was not responsive because it had to have a fixed graphic, but it did have a lot of other advanced features. Okay, then this one here was designed a little bit later. Now this whole thing is not the website. This is actually a bunch of the things I did for them. There's a postcard design. I designed the logo for them, but the website itself is right up here. And again, heavily designed visually, but lots of interactivity with the uppermost navigation and the secondary navigation. And the image in the background, that sort of flowing water material thing, moved a little bit in the background. So there was just a little bit of inherent animation to it. This one here, this was for a holistic center. Again, this was more grid built. This was built into, as you can see from the tables here, more of a table system, so they could draw information from a database. This one here, and we're just going to sort of scroll through them. So these three that we just went through are all kind of similar in design. These were all done within a couple of years of each other. And so they all have similar sort of design techniques. What I like about this one is sort of the modular grid down here where the information is sort of stacked and just little cubes of information. And this was all linkable to larger pages full of more information. Now, this one here was done in 2013. It is a scrolling parallax website. You can't see it here in the screenshot, but it would continue to scroll. And then as it scrolled along, different elements would move out of the way or would scroll around. This call-out box would pop up. Social media links would fly in and fly out. There was forms that you could interact with, all sorts of links at the bottom. And it was a big, long scrolling site. Now, the big innovation in this one was there was also a mobile version of it, which is this one here that I also designed for them. And this worked on folding accordion systems. And so this was the first mobile site that I designed. And since then I've done other stuff. But just to sort of show you the evolution, just in my sort of personal work, of how websites have come along through the ages, from something like this, which really just kind of looks like a postcard that happened to be a website, to this, which is much more modern and consistent with what we might see today with mobile apps and devices. Okay, so there's our history of the web, a little overview of different types of websites that I ended up working on that sort of go through some of this history. I was not born in 1969, so I couldn't have done stuff back then. But anyway, since the late 1990s at least. Okay, so your assignment. So your homework is to basically read through this handout. This is our historical or speculative paper and digital poster. This is your very first assignment. So based on the history that we just went over, you're going to read through this, and I'm not going to read through it with you here. You can read, you know what you're doing, and you are going to pick an area of the history of the web that you find most interesting, and you are going to work on a historical or speculative research paper for it, and in the end you're going to create sort of a digital graphic to go along with it. But for now, read through this and just get familiar with it, and we'll talk more about it on next week, okay? All right, you guys are great. I'm glad you hung out for this. Be sure to watch through this a couple times if you have to make sure you get everything, and certainly download these. If you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, pop in and see me during my online office hours, which are posted under announcements, and I will talk to you soon.